Welcome to Disciple Dojo. We're continuing our walk through the Olivet Discourse, Mark chapter 13. If you've missed previous episodes, you need to watch those first. This series builds on what we've done already. So if this is the first time you're seeing this, maybe it popped up in your algorithm and you haven't watched any of the previous episodes, go ahead and watch those first. They're going to be linked in the video description below. And you need to watch them sequentially or else you might be lost. But in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Abomination of Desolation. That's such a great biblical apocalyptic phrase. So as we jump in, if you haven't subscribed already, we would really appreciate it if you would do that. And thank you so much to all 50,000 plus of you that have done that so far. You guys are amazing. This channel continues to grow because of, as they say back in the old public telethon drives, viewers like you. All right, let's jump back into the Olivet Discourse. So in the last episode, Jesus had talked about there's going to be wars, rumors of wars. He warned the disciples of the persecution that they were going to face, how just like he is going to be, they will also be taken before the Sanhedrin, before governors and kings, as witnesses to the kingdom of God. Just like in the days of the prophets of old, like Micah, as we looked at, even one's own family members will turn against them. And that's sadly what happened among a lot of Jesus's followers, and even among other Jews during the period leading up to the destruction of the temple. Josephus talked a lot about this. And so Jesus is letting them know this is what's going to happen. Be ready to be hated on account of my name, but stand firm to the end. And by the way, this is going to be pretty much the entire message of the book of Revelation, Mark 13:13. And on that occasion, Jesus will speak to his followers in that period, going through their persecution. But this is decades before that. And he's just warned them. And then he makes this phrase in verse 14. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation being stood where it must not. And I've translated estekota hopu ude, really literally, being stood, some say standing, but I believe this is an aorist rather than an imperfect, so sort of has a completed action sense to it rather than ongoing action. But being stood where it must not. And this could also be translated being stood where he must not. And then he has this parenthetical phrase. This is not in red letters. That's why it's on white here on your screen. Let the one reading understand. Now, this is Mark talking to the reader. Let the one reading understand. This is kind of coded language. The abomination of desolation being stood where it must not, or standing where he must not. Let the reader understand. Then let the ones in Judea flee to the mountains. The one on the roof must not go down, nor go inside to get anything from his house, and the one in the field must not turn back behind to get his cloak. And woe to the pregnant ones and the nursing ones in those days, and pray that it does not happen in bad weather, for those days will be suffering such as there has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and will never be. And if the Lord hadn't shortened the days, all flesh would not be saved. But this is what I want to key in this episode, is this idea of the abomination of desolation. Ta deligma tes eremoseos. That's a mouthful. What is this? What is this abomination of desolation? So this is actually an Old Testament expression. William Lane, in his commentary on Mark, he says the Semitic expression used in Daniel, that's where it comes from, describes an abomination so detestable it causes the temple to be abandoned by the people of God and provokes desolation. This mode of expression occurs in passages dealing with persecution and the oppression of the people of God. So there's only 3 times in the Hebrew Bible that this expression is found. And in Daniel 9, there's the passage about the 70 weeks and then one being the anointed one being cut off. And there's question about what is Daniel 9 referring to, which we won't look at in this episode, but it does use this phrase. It says, he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. And it uses the phrase, deligma eremoseos. Now in Daniel 9, there is, I think, some legitimate question about who the he is. Some people will say, oh, it's the Antichrist, and they link it with all of these other Old Testament passages, and then they read that into the Olivet Discourse, and then boom, that's how you end up with Left Behind. But putting all that aside, there's a legitimate question. Is this talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, somebody who's going to come later and do something in the temple? Or is this talking about something that's going to happen in the first century? Just put a pin in that. Like, I don't think it matters which of these the Abomination of Desolation is referring to in Daniel 9, because I think Daniel 11 and 12 are pretty clear. In Daniel 11, there's a whole section, this prophecy, the king of the north, the king of the south, and almost every Daniel commentator I'm aware of recognizes that the he in those passages that's being talked about is Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, the one who would come and who would profane the temple, who would persecute God's people, who would try to stamp out all vestiges of the worship of the God of Israel. And so in describing it apocalyptically, Daniel 11, it says, forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate, the deligma eremosios. And then the last chapter in Daniel, chapter 12, when it's kind of tying everything up, there's this sort of timeline that's given that works out to about 167 BC. And it says, from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that desolates, again, deligma eremosios, is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So without jumping in and doing an in-depth study of Daniel, the idea is that Daniel talked about this detestable thing. That's what deligma means. This abomination, this thing that's just abhorrent, so much that it will make desolate, it will make abandoned, it will turn into a wasteland. So it's an abomination that results in desolation. That's how you could translate this genitive. And as N.T. Wright points out, this phrase, abomination of desolation, was applied to the action of Antiochus Epiphanes by the author of First Maccabees. So after Daniel, during the intertestamental period, the author of First Maccabees, which if you're Orthodox or Catholic, that is part of the Old Testament. For Jews and Protestants, it's not part of their scriptures. But even for us Protestants, the apocryphal books are incredibly important historical works. And this is an example of why we should read them. You know, we need to be reading things like Maccabees and the other deuterocanonical or apocryphal books, as well as Josephus and other historical writings, because all of it affects how we read scripture. And in the case of Maccabees, in Maccabees chapter 1, the very first chapter of First Maccabees is where you find this phrase. The only other time outside of Daniel that I'm aware of that you find this phrase, deligma eremosios. Towards the end of the chapter, setting up all the action of the book of Maccabees, it says, now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege. I think this is the RSV Catholic edition, the translation I'm using, but that's how they're translating deligma eremosios, a desolating sacrilege, or something so sacrilegious that it leads to desolation. So Antiochus's forces, along with a number of the Jews who were abandoning their worship of the God of Israel, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. This is in the temple in Jerusalem. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king, Antiochus Epiphanes. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, so it started on the 15th day, so 10 days later, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. So they erected an altar, and we find out that this was an altar to Zeus, by the way. This was Antiochus set up an altar to Zeus. I think the tradition was they sacrificed a pig on it, like as abominable as you could get to a Torah observant Jew. And so they built the altar on top of God's altar and offered a sacrifice on it. And this is what the author of First Maccabees describes as the abomination that causes desolation, the abomination of desolation. And in First Maccabees, this is the point at which Mattathias and the other Maccabean revolutionaries flee out into the mountains to regroup and to then begin their revolt against Antiochus and his forces. So N.T. Wright kind of ties the threads together. He says, the natural implication in the first century AD, so when Jesus was using this phrase, because by the time of Jesus, it had been over 150 years since the abomination of desolation, aka Antiochus Epiphanes, had arisen to oppress God's people and had ultimately been overthrown and had been judged, and the temple cleansed and restored. And that's where we have Hanukkah, rededication of the temple. And so for Jesus to say, when you see the abomination of desolation, the deligma eremosios, wink, wink, like that's what the let the reader understand is, right? Says the natural implication in the first century AD would be that the Romans, the present occupying forces, would destroy the city and the temple, setting up their own abomination in place of the sacrificial system. And that's actually, I think, a pretty strong argument that that's what is being referred to in Daniel 9. Unlike Daniel 11 and 12, which is clearly referring to what's going to happen under Antiochus Epiphanes, I think a strong case can be made, and it's beyond the scope of this study, but a strong case can be made that the Daniel 9 abomination of desolation is referring to what Rome is going to do in the first century. But even if that's not the case, nothing is, predicated upon that being true. That's just where I lean right now. But even if that's not the case, what Jesus is doing in the Olivet Discourse is he's saying, hey, when things start to get like they were under Antiochus, get out of here. That's basically what he's saying. And that's what France concludes as well. In his commentary, says its use, the phrase abomination of desolation, its use in the first century could be understood only of an event or an object which in some recognizable way corresponded to what Antiochus had done. Some such sacrilege will mark the beginning of the process which leads to the temple's destruction. What the disciples should be on the lookout for then seems to be a repetition in some way of the sacrilege of 167 BC. So in some way, Jesus is saying there's going to be another abomination of desolation. Now, what specifically could that be referring to? This is where commentators have offered a number of suggestions, and LePau summarizes them in his commentary. Some think that Jesus is referring to, the standards that Roman soldiers carried. The literal banner that they marched under was a giant eagle, or vulture, the same word like we talked about. So some have suggested, the Romans would burn sacrifices to their standard. I mean, Rome was worshipped for its might. And so some have suggested that the abomination of desolation is referring to the Roman soldiers burning the sacrifices to their eagle, or possibly even the destruction of the temple itself when it was made desolate. But LePau says that's not likely because that's too late to signal that people should flee. So in other words, when this was happening, when Roman soldiers had surrounded Jerusalem, when they were offering sacrifice to their standards, or even when they had started to burn the temple down itself, that's not a helpful sign, because it would have been too late to take Jesus' advice to flee to the mountains. So probably that's not what Jesus is referring to. Now, others have suggested that what the abomination of desolation is referring to is the order that Caligula gave. The Emperor Caligula ordered in AD 3940 that a statue of himself be set up in the temple. I mean, that would absolutely be an abomination, standing where it should not be in the temple. So maybe that's what Jesus was referring to. The only problem is that one, that's decades before. Jerusalem wasn't destroyed till 70 AD, so that's 30 years before the events would happen. That's way early for it to be a really useful sign. But the bigger reason that that's probably not what Jesus is referring to is Caligula died before this could happen. This was never carried out. So that's probably an unlikely candidate. Some have said, no, it's referring to the Antichrist. An Antichrist who is still to come, a future Antichrist, is going to stand in the temple and desecrate it, which of course means the temple will need to be rebuilt, which means the Dome of the Rock will need to be torn down, and the red heifer will need to be bred, and all that's kind of driving the end times hysteria going on, focusing on Jerusalem. Problem with that, as we've already looked at in the Olivet Discourse, is Jesus was really clear that what he's talking about would occur within that generation. He's not talking about something that's going to happen thousands of years later. He's telling his followers what they need to be on the lookout for. So is it possible that in the future something like this may also happen, that there can be sort of recapitulating signs and prophecy? Sure, maybe that's possible, but we can all at least hopefully agree that's not primarily what Jesus was warning his followers to be on the lookout for, because they'd all be long dead by then. So LePeau goes on to say, what event is, one, a sacrilege, and two, neither too soon nor too late to be an effective warning? And he suggests, and he's not the only one, a number of interpreters suggest this, the events surrounding the zealots taking over around 67, 68. They took over the temple. They actually appointed their own unqualified high priest. And the actual high priest, Ananus, even expressed his own grief that he, quote, had seen the house of God full of so many abominations. R.T. France unpacks this as well in his commentary. He says, in the winter of 67, 68, the zealots under John of Giscala took over the temple itself as their headquarters, appointing their own mock high priest to carry out a travesty of temple ritual. Popular outrage led to fighting within the temple itself. And Josephus writes about this in Book 4 of his Jewish Wars, with zealot blood defiling the sanctuary. And then he goes on to note in Josephus' Jewish War, Book 4, verse 388, he mentions an ancient prophecy. So Josephus talks about this ancient prophecy that the city would be taken and the temple burned when, quote, native hands had first defiled it. And Josephus sees this prophecy fulfilled in the zealots' actions. Now, so France says, might Mark's readers have recognized in these events the deligma tes eremosios, and possibly even have referred the masculine estekota, that verb that we talked about, being stood where he should not, as referring to John of Giscala? And France just suggests, he says in the next sentence, he goes on to say, we don't know. We can't know that that's specifically what Jesus was referring to, but it would fit pretty well. In that passage he's talking about in Jewish Wars that Josephus wrote, Josephus said, for there was an ancient saying of inspired men that the city would be taken and the sanctuary burned to the ground by right of war when it should be visited by sedition, and native hands should be the first to defile God's sacred precinct. This saying the zealots did not disbelieve, like the zealots even believed this, yet they lent themselves as instruments of its accomplishment. So regardless of what specifically Jesus had in mind when he talked about when you see the abomination of desolation being stood where it must not, he could have been referring to a number of things. I think France and LePeau make a good case. I think they're right that it's referring to the mockery that took place when violent, murdering brigands that were so focused on overthrowing Rome that they would defile the temple itself. I mean, that's something that would have just been unheard of, not even in Old Testament times, but also during the Maccabean revolt. Like, it's just completely desecrating the temple to use it as your battle headquarters to overthrow an earthly empire. And that's exactly what Jesus is warning his followers not to do, by the way. So I think it fits like a glove. I think that all of those events, the zealots taking over Jerusalem and taking over the temple and putting in place their own high priest and even shedding blood in the temple, like, I think it's Jesus was talking about something related to that. And these were very public, very known events. Josephus even talks about them. And so look what Jesus says to do. When you see that happening, whatever the abomination of desolation is, when you see it happening, let the ones in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, he doesn't say let the ones in Jerusalem flee to the mountains, although of course that would have been included because Jerusalem is within Judea. But this is bigger than just Jerusalem at this point. When these things start happening, in Jerusalem, everybody in Judea needs to basically, we would say, head for the hills. And that's what Christians did. Jesus' followers did that. William Lane notes in his commentary, these acts of sacrilege were climaxed in the winter of 67-68 by the farcical investiture of the clown Phani as high priest. That's the name of the guy who the zealots made as the illegitimate high priest. It was in response to this that Ananus made that lament. He said, it would have been far better for me to have died before I had seen the house of God laden with such abominations and its unapproachable and hallowed places crowded with the feet of murderers. So Lane goes on to say, it seems probable that Judean Christians recognized in Phani the appalling sacrilege, usurping a position which is not his. And that's how he's translating Abomination of Desolation, standing where it should not be. He said that it's probable that the Judean Christians, the followers of Jesus in that region, recognized this. They made that same connection and knew that that was consigning the temple to destruction. And in response to Jesus's warning, they fled to Pella. Eusebius writes about this. Others have noted Christians got out. They were not, for the most part, Jesus' followers were not in Jerusalem when it was destroyed. They had, as readers understood, the abomination of desolation was the signal to get out because Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. And this is why N.T. Wright says that Jesus was vindicated by this. He said, when these events take place, the prophet who has prophesied them will be well and truly vindicated. Just like Jeremiah and the other Old Testament prophets we looked at a couple episodes ago that prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and were rejected for that, were persecuted for that. But yet in the end, that's exactly what happened. And they were vindicated as prophets of the God of Israel. Right, saying that that's what's going to happen when this all takes place. And Jesus will have been vindicated as the prophet par excellence of Israel. So when the story that Jesus has told, the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, that's the suffering we'll look at in the next episode, the chaos of catastrophic world events, that's the wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famine. When all these come to pass, this will be to the disciples the sign that they asked for at the start of the chapter. Remember that the disciples asked, hey, tell us, when are these things going to happen and what is going to be the sign? And of course, some people say, well, what kind of sign is that? The destruction of Jerusalem being a sign? How is that vindicating anybody? Just the idea that Jerusalem's destruction would be Jesus's vindication. That's reeks of anti-Semitism, replacement theology, all that stuff. Wright's basically like, let's nip that in the bud real quick. He says, this, in case anybody should even imagine it, was not, of course, in any sense an anti-Jewish thing to do. Jesus was claiming to be speaking for Israel's true ancestral traditions, denouncing what he saw as deviation and corruption at the very heart of Israel's present life. In this regard, Jesus was no different than what the Essenes at Qumran had said about the temple and about it being completely defiled and God going to judge it. Various groups within Judaism would denounce the leadership in Jerusalem, the temple hierarchy. I mean, Josephus himself does it as well. So in no way is it, if you are anti-Semitic and you hate Jews, then of course you'll latch onto stuff like this and use it to spin all kinds of nonsense. But that doesn't say anything about the content of what Jesus is saying. That's just because sinful people can twist scripture for sinful ends, and they have been doing that since scripture has been a thing. It's important to keep in mind, Jesus is standing thoroughly within the tradition of Israel's own prophets. Jesus was no more anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic than Jeremiah. So Jesus warns his followers, get out. When you see this happening, get out. And he's super urgent about it. He says the one on the roof must not go down or go inside to get anything from his house. The roof of a house was kind of where you did stuff, and the stairs were most of the time on the outside of the house. So to go in the house, if you're on the roof, you can't just, there's no elevator. You go down the steps on the outside of the house and go back into the house to get stuff. Jesus is like, if you're on the roof and you see this happen, get out. Don't even go back in the house. Just go. The one in the field must not turn behind to get his cloak. If you're working in the field, you take your cloak off. Your cloak was like your main garment. It was what you slept in. It was your identity marker. It was just, your cloak was super important. And so if you're going to go work in the field, you don't work with your cloak on. You take your cloak off, put it somewhere, maybe put it in the shade, go work in the field. And then when you're done, you come back to where your cloak is. Jesus says, if this happens while you're in the field, get out. Don't even grab your cloak. So this is hyperbolic language. He is saying as vehemently as he can, you cannot linger. This is your sign. Leave, because it's about to be horrendous. It's going to be so bad, he says, verse 17, woe to the pregnant ones and the nursing ones in those days. So women who are pregnant or nursing small children, woe to them. Why? Because traveling over rough terrain when you're pregnant or when you have a nursing baby, there are few things more inconvenient than that, shall we say. And he says, and pray that it doesn't happen in bad weather. And some have translated chemonos as in winter. It can mean both. This can refer to the season we know of as winter, or it can just be referring to bad weather. And either way, like, that makes travel hard. There were no highways. There were no paved roads. There were no rest stops, no 7-Elevens. You're talking about traveling through rough, hilly terrain in the ancient world. And so Jesus is like, is going to be awful. So why would he say flee to the mountains? There's a couple of reasons. Lepo has talked about this and given some great examples. In the Old Testament, the flee to the mountains is a common expression. He says it's not a sign of cowardice. Usually the point is save yourselves so something new can be started. And there are examples, the angels urged Lot and his wife in Genesis 19 to flee to avoid the coming destruction. Ezekiel chapter 7, Ezekiel said the fugitives, when Jerusalem was destroyed, would flee to the mountains. In Zechariah 2 and Zechariah 14, those who flee to the mountains will see God's victory on their behalf. But the key is, I think, more than all of those, the loudest resonance is what happens in 1 Maccabees. In 1 Maccabees, chapters 1 and 2, the heroes, the Maccabees, they flee to the mountains. 1 Maccabees 2:27, Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. Verse 28, then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. So fleeing to the hills and leaving everything you have in the town, that's language straight from 1 Maccabees 2:28. And it's exactly the language Jesus uses. Same verb, fugo, to flee. Let the ones in Judea flee. And where are they to flee? Es taore, to the mountain or to the hill country. Well, that's exactly what you see in 1 Maccabees 2:28. And they fled es tahore, to the mountains. This is not accidental. This is loud and clear what Jesus is. Jesus is alluding heavily to the events of 1 Maccabees. And Wright picks up on that. I mean, most interpreters pick up on this. This isn't anything new. But I think Wright does a great way of encapsulating. He says the force of it, like Jesus alluding to the events of Maccabees, the force is to warn that there is a coming crisis upon Jerusalem, a crisis in which the official temple cult will be compromised and will need to be torn down. At that time, those who are true members of Israel, loyal to the covenant, must run away to the hills, leaving their possessions in the city. That's exactly what 1 Maccabees 2:28 had said. The way of loyalty was the way of flight. Such flight would not betoken cowardice. It would be undertaken with the intention of regrouping as a body in order subsequently to be vindicated as the true people, indeed the true leaders. Mattathias' flight to the hills ended with his family becoming the new royal house. That's why the book is named Maccabees. So Jesus, again, telling them, get out. Don't even go get your stuff. Like, this is all Maccabees language. And it's also counterintuitive. It's not the first thing you would think to do because, as Lane notes, ordinarily Jerusalem is regarded as the place of refuge par excellence. Like, Jerusalem was a walled, fortified city. So if you're out in Judea and trouble happens, you would flee to Jerusalem from the mountains. Jesus is telling them to do the exact opposite, just like the Maccabean revolutionaries had done a century and a half before. Everybody would be clamoring to get into Jerusalem for safety, for protection. But in the circumstances described, the almost impregnable walls of the city will offer no real defense to its inhabitants. In fact, those who remained in the city during the siege of Jerusalem found themselves helplessly trapped between starvation and violent destruction. We looked at Josephus's account in a previous episode in the series about the conditions in Jerusalem leading up to its destruction, and they were utterly horrendous. And just to summarize, Lane is pulling from Josephus's account in this section of his commentary. He says, Jewish forces won an impressive victory over the 12th Legion commanded by Cestius Gallus in November of 66, so 4 years before the destruction. Many persons in Jerusalem, however, recognized that eventually the zealot forces would suffer inevitable defeat, and those who were realistic began leaving the city in droves, apparently unimpeded. No efforts were marshaled to frustrate desertions from the city until the spring of 68. That's around the time of the Abomination of Desolation. After that is when the zealots and the people in Jerusalem started not letting people leave, started killing people who thought about deserting. But up until spring of 68, Christians in Jerusalem would have had no difficulty leaving the city unless they delayed their departure until a relatively late stage in the conflict. See, once it happened, if they delayed much longer, they were trapped in Jerusalem. And Jesus saying, pray that it doesn't happen in winter or bad weather. Well, the peril of flight in winter is that streams swollen by heavy rains would be impossible to cross and could prevent many from reaching a place of refuge. It happened that during the spring of AD 68, due to recent rainstorms, the Jordan River was too high and swift for gathering fugitives to cross from east to west to seek safety in Jericho. Josephus talks about this in Jewish War. After the rainy season had made the river swollen and too hard to cross, it would be really hard to get out at that point. So you can see the dire warning that Jesus is giving and why he's saying the things he's saying if he's talking about the events clustered around those 1 to 2 years leading up to 70 AD. There's a short window of time that you had between when things happened and when it was too late. So France summarizes those events leading up to it. He says, since much of Judea, including Jerusalem and many of the main cities, is in the mountains, it's all in the hill country, Jesus saying flee to the mountains may be a call not so much to immigrate to another province as to abandon the towns and hide away in the hills. Not if you're in Judea, you have to go to Galilee or you have to go to, even as far as Pella. He could just be saying, get out of the towns. I like the phrase, head for the hills. I think that captures it very well. That could be what Jesus is saying because, Rome would come in and the cities would be the targets. And that's kind of what happens. France goes on to note, after the initial abortive campaign of Cestius Gallus in Judea in late 66, Vespasian concentrated first on Galilee and Perea, but then brought most of Judea under control in the early part of 68. Operations were then suspended owing to the Roman Civil War, until a further campaign in mid-69 subjugated the rest of the province, except Jerusalem and the fortresses of Herodium and Masada. It was not until Passover of AD 70, after Vespasian had again suspended the war to become emperor, that Titus's army arrived before the walls of Jerusalem. So, those 2 years between 66 and 68, that was pushing it. That was cutting it close if you were going to get out. After 68, it would have been much harder. And then certainly leading up to 70, by mid-69, it would have been almost impossible to get out. Now, this is the thing. I think we'll key in on this and then pick up in the next episode with the rest of the discourse. But if Jesus is talking about the end of the world, as the Olivet Discourse is typically read by, popular level readings, why, if he's talking about his return and the end of everything, what kind of advice would it be to flee to the mountains? That doesn't make any sense. When Jesus returns, there's nowhere you could flee. That's the whole point of the second coming. Wright actually picked up on this. There's a quote he gives by George Caird, wonderful New Testament scholar of a generation ago. He said, referring to Jesus's advice to when you see this, head for the hills, He says, this is advice more useful to a refugee for military invasion than to a man caught unawares by the last trumpet. Like, doesn't make any sense. If this is Jesus talking about the end of the world, it doesn't matter where you run, you're not going to get anywhere. So clearly Jesus is not talking about the end of the world. So after noting that, right, says the disciples are not to stay and fight for the physical survival of Jerusalem. They're not to do what the zealots did. They are not to be implicated in the coming war. Jesus will die at the hands of the Romans on the charge of being a Jewish rebel, but they are not to do so. No mistaken sense of loyalty must sway them into trying to bridge the kingdom after all by means of the sword. Rather, they are to waste no time. They must run away. See, for the zealots, it was all about forcing God's hand, like taking that stand. And even if all of the armies of the world surround Jerusalem, God will not let anything happen to the apple. He who touches Jerusalem touches the apple of his eye. You know, they had their Hebrew Bibles just like we do. And so they were willing to stand against overwhelming odds. And many of them believed that that's when God would intervene and would overthrow Rome and would establish his kingdom in Jerusalem, fulfilling all of the promises made to the ancestors that Jerusalem would be the mountain exalted over all the earth and that the Gentile kings would come and serve and just all of that Zionistic theology. They were banking on it. And the thing is, Jesus is the only one who could have legitimately ordered his followers to do that. He could have legitimately called on 10,000 legions of angels. He could have, that was the temptation that he was first offered at the beginning of his ministry, to take the kingdom by force. That was the way of the tempter. That was the way of Satan. And Jesus rejected that way. And he called on his followers to reject that way. And for 2,000 years, so many of Jesus' self-proclaimed followers have not seemed to get that message. You know, the Olivet Discourse is up there, I think, with books like Revelation as being the most anti-Christian nationalist texts in all of Scripture. You know, recently we had Caleb Campbell on and we talked about Christian nationalism and his new book, Disarming Leviathan, and the call to follow the Lamb rather than the dragon. Staying in Jerusalem and fighting against Rome was following the dragon. It was trying to beat the dragon with the dragon's own weapons. Jesus called his followers to do the exact opposite. Why? Because his kingdom is not of this world. The idea of a politically powerful Jerusalem that rules the other nations is too small a vision for Israel's Messiah. It may be the vision of a lot of people that think they're honoring Israel's Messiah, whether they think Jesus is that Messiah and they're wanting to set up some dominionist rule on, earthly powers and all that, or whether they're still looking for a Messiah to come and that's when these things will happen. Jesus repudiates that entirely. And he does it because that vision is too small. He is not interested in setting up a theocratic nation in a spot of land in the Middle East. Because while some people think true worship should be in Jerusalem and some people think true worship should be in Samaria, what did he tell the woman at the well? No, the time is coming when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And that'll be worldwide. Every nation, every language, every people, to the ends of the earth. That's the vision that Jesus is instilling and that the rest of the New Testament will build upon. And so that's why the Messiah of Israel can tell his followers, when you see these events, get out of this city, because Jerusalem, once again, just like in Jeremiah's day, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And paradoxically, that will be the vindication of the Son of Man, whose kingdom will never end and will go to the ends of the earth. The suffering servant in Isaiah, whose reign extends throughout the earth, who even the Gentiles put their hope in. This video would be hours long if we tried to tie up all the strands that Jesus is plucking from in his vision for the kingdom. But the main thing to keep in mind, the Abomination of Desolation, whatever it was something that took place in Jerusalem in the first century, sometime in the late 60s, and it was the sign that Jesus's followers were asking for when things were about to happen, and they got it. and they left. And that's why they weren't there for the most part when Jerusalem was destroyed. So we'll stop there. Next episode, we're going to look at this whole suffering that hasn't been since the world was created and never will be again, and God cutting it short, or else no flesh would survive, and then the sun and the moon and the stars and all that kind of stuff. We've dabbled in it. We've touched on it. We've given the Old Testament background for it in previous episodes. So we'll take a bit of a closer look at those and try to tie everything together, and then conclude with the parables that Jesus gives his followers. Like, hey, so this is what you should learn from all this. So if that interests you, click the subscribe button and enable notifications. That'll let you know whenever we have new content here on the channel. And we do different things here at Disciple Dojo. So some of you, this may be your jam and you like the teaching and the in-depth, long form, walking through scripture. Well, we do other stuff. We do study Bible reviews. We do interviews with authors and scholars, and there are other things happening, and those might be of interest to you as well. So enabling notifications lets you know when something is posted here at the dojo, and you can decide whether or not it's something that you're interested in. But regardless, it really helps us when you do. So we'll call it a day for now. Stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo. And in the meantime, you know what I'm going to say. Keep training.